Thank you all for helping make it be that way. I should also say this is joint work with Darryl Rowbottom and William Keaton, neither of whom could be here. So the usual caveat applies. All the hard questions, they're happy to take them, and I'll take everything else. This talk kind of falls in the genre of taking a old debate in philosophy of science and thinking about how it plays out in the context of contemporary AI systems, but particularly deep learning systems. That's what we're most interested in. And so here's what's going to happen. I'll say a little bit about sort of the traditional non-AI related numericals argument and its relevance to contemporary AI systems. And I mean, in a way, what we try to do in this paper is think about what it would take to run a version of this argument for an AI. Think about the special assumptions you would have to make to do that. And that's going to be the brunt of the talk. That'll happen in section 2. I'm going to use what's probably by now everyone's favorite example, AlphaFold 2, to illustrate why in particular you might care about this, just to sort of put some bones on the sketch of an argument that I'll give you in section 2. And then we'll have some upshots at the end. Okay, so I think unsurprising at this point that machine learning and especially deep learning is playing an increasingly significant role in science. And some of these applications, AlphaFold 2 being among them, have led to some pretty striking predictive triumphs. Mel told us a little bit about the protein prediction problem yesterday, so I won't say too much more about it. The basic problem is to take an unfolded amino acid sequence and determine its 3D conformation. This is computationally extremely hard because there are a ton of possible conformations for a given sequence. Computer scientists have looked at the computational complexity of this, and there's sort of various subproblems related to protein folding. And it turns out that just about every one of them is NP hard. So at least in general, we don't know a better way to do this than brute force search. So here's a diagram you've seen a few times already. Lots of work has been done attempting, trying to come up with automated protein structure prediction systems. So AlphaFold here, what does it do? You give it an input sequence, some magic happens in the middle, and you get a prediction of the 3D structure out at the other end. AlphaFold, I mean, it's really kind of hard to overstate just how much of a success this was. It was one of the first systems to get sort of near atomic accuracy, at least when compared to experimental methods. The median accuracy, at least for backbone protein chain prediction, was less than an angstrom, which is kind of remarkable. So already that's sort of striking, and you might wonder, it's what is AlphaFold doing that accounts for its success at this particular task? I think the second thing, though, that's even more striking is that with a little bit of fussing of the input encodings, you can get it to generate some pretty good predictions, not just for single chain amino acids. So AlphaFold was trained on a database of single chain amino acids, including lots of experimentally solved single chains. But with a little bit of tinkering for the input encoding, you can get it to come up with pretty good predictions for multi-chain amino acid sequences too. And that's sort of surprising because it wasn't at least explicitly trained on any, so it hadn't seen any of these things, but nonetheless is able to come up with pretty good predictions for their structure as well. And so you may wonder, what explains AlphaFold 2's remarkable predictive success? And this is a problem that practitioners are worried about as well. I don't want to let you know quite what they have to say yet, so keep you in suspense. But yeah, so there's this sort of review paper by Skolnick and colleagues that sort of tries to figure out, can we start to understand what AlphaFold is doing that accounts for its success. And they start off by noting that it seems to work as if by magic. So I want to shift gears a little bit and say something about scientific theory. So this question, what accounts for AlphaFold's success? Its remarkable predictive success, especially in the context of multiple novel predictions, like what we got, particularly in the case of multi-chain amino acid sequences. You could ask sort of an analogous question, and philosophers have asked analogous questions about mature scientific theories. So here is an extremely sort of schematic, idealized picture of what scientific theories do. You give them something like some initial conditions, something happens, and you get predictions out the other end. Obviously, you could complicate this in like lots of ways. Maybe, we should be spitting out other things besides predictions. Maybe you want explanation or understanding of stuff there too. Maybe you don't want to have just initial conditions on the input side. Maybe you want things to loop around. Obviously, you can complicate this. But sort of just focusing on this sort of very simplified view of mature scientific theories as prediction engines, if you like, you might ask an analogous question. What explains a mature scientific theory's predictive success? And there's a very popular answer endorsed by scientific realists, which basically says, well, the starting point for this answer is, look, whatever else accounts for the success of a mature scientific theory, it can't render that success miraculous. So something has to explain it. And the most popular answer developed by scientific realists is that this empirical success is accounted for by the fact that scientific theories are typically approximately true, or at least in large part, or maybe central claims of the theories are approximately true. This sort of idea put in this form was, I think, developed, or at least put this way, first by Putnam in the 1975 collection here. And there have been lots of sort of subsequent attempts to develop this argument and take this suggestive remark and turn it into something a little more rigorous. We're just going to focus on one in particular to Cohen-Hausen. So this is, you can think of this rendering of the no miracles argument as a kind of comparison of likelihoods. So let approx t be the claim that t is approximately true. Let S be the claim that T is empirically successful. And in this case, we're sort of interested in theories which yield multiple novel predictions. Novelty is sort of the important thing. And so given that, then the argument just has two premises. So the first premise is that the likelihood of success given approximate truth is high. Premise two is that the likelihood of empirical success given the negation of approximate truth is low. Then you conclude from that that the likelihood of approximate truth given that success is high. So this is one way of taking Putnam's remark and turning it into kind of argument. It's not the only way, but it's the one we're going to use. So there's lots of sort of questions you could raise about this argument. There's lots of ongoing debate about it. We're not going to worry about that right now. Instead, we want to ask this question. Could you run a similar argument for predictively successful AI systems, something like AlphaFold 2? And at least on the face of it, it's not entirely clear how it would go. If you try to transpose Putnam's suggestive remark directly over to the AlphaFold case, you just kind of get gibberish. Empirical successes in science enabled by machine learning systems are non-miraculous because such systems are typically or probably approximately true. I think it's sort of at best obscure what that might mean. So what this means is that we can't just take a no miracles argument off the shelf and apply it to a system like AlphaFold. We're going to have to tinker with the formulation of the argument a little bit. And that's really the project of the paper that this talk is based on. So we think there are at least three main modifications or relaxings of assumptions you need to make in order for this to work. One concern is just that you might not think that there are truth bearers present in systems like AlphaFold. The standard no miracles argument concerns scientific theories. These are framed in, if you like, sentential, maybe propositional terms. They're composed of things that can be true or false, but not clear that you have anything that looks like a truth bearer in contemporary, say, machine learning systems, at least in every case. So that's one issue. Something a little more, I think, sort of a deeper issue is that it's unclear whether systems like AlphaFold can contain representations in the way that they might need to in order to run an AI-specific no miracles argument. And then third, even if we can somehow sort of say something about those first two, you might nevertheless think that there's no direct analog in the AI case or the machine learning case, because the traditional no miracles argument is framed in terms of scientific theories, but there might not be any appropriate analog of theory inside something like AlphaFold. So we need to say something about that too. So how do we, what should you say, let's put it that way, if you want to try to run an AI-specific no miracles argument? So like I said, scientific theories are expressed in propositional terms. They're capable of being approximately true or false, at least on standard renderings. They're framed in terms of linguistic or language-like representations, but it's not obvious that the information inside predictably successful AIs is propositional or language-like. I mean, maybe that's more plausible in some cases than others. Maybe like a large language model, it's a little more plausible, but something like AlphaFold 2 strikes me as extremely less plausible. I think there's a very natural way of going here. We just need to generalize a little bit. So the property of being truth-like is just a more specific way of being veridical or accurately or faithfully representing. And so what this means is that if you're going to try to run an AI-specific no miracles argument, you should frame it in terms of the broader notion of representational accuracy. Now, there's a lot you would need to say about this to sort of make it plausible. Accuracy plausibly comes in degrees. So we'd be interested in, whether or not a system contains representations which have a suitably high degree of accuracy, or at least that would be part of the argument. And I think, maybe one way to sort of complicate this a little bit would be to say, well, let me put it this way. There are lots of different ways of being veridical, and you can have kind of mixed representational formats. And so even if, and it's possible for something to represent accurately if it has mixed representational formats. So these could include sort of propositional or language-like representational formats, but also something more imagistic as well. And so a labeled map is sort of an example of this. You've got the labels, so that's Hong Kong. So you've got sort of the labels for different areas on Hong Kong. The sort of propositional content, if you like, there is something like, I don't know, low islands or low Toon Moon, something like that. But there is sort of content there that isn't captured by those labels. You've got the coloring, which marks off different regions. So the thought here is something like in moving to the notion of the broader notion of representational accuracy, having sort of labeled maps is a kind of useful metaphor for how there could be, for what representational accuracy might be in its broader sense. Okay, so that's sort of, the response to the first kind of concern. These things don't have truth evaluable or like truth apt components, but the response is just a little bit broader. I think something a little more problematic is the concern that you might think that there's something special about scientific representation in particular, such that it essentially involves agents or their intentions. So this is a fairly popular view in the philosophy of science, associated with folks like Ron Geer, Mauricio Suarez, and Florian, who I'll come back to in just a second. It's too bad he's not here. But the thought is just that scientific representation essentially involves agents. So here's what Geer has to say about it. Representation with models can't just be a matter of similarity between the model and the model. There are two major reasons why this is so. First, you got to know what similarities matter, because there's always going to be some respects in which two things are similar to each other. And then secondly, similarities is a symmetrical relation, while representation is asymmetrical. Okay, so Geer has a job description in mind, and he wants something that's going to fit that job description. And the thing he thinks that is going to fit it is the introduction of agents. So if we add the intentions of an agent or agents, both of these problems disappear. Agents specify which similarities are intended and for what purpose. In the case of AI systems in particular, there has been some skepticism, I think probably most notably by Florian, that these could contain representations of the kind that would facilitate or at least help you underwrite an AI-specific no miracles argument. So Florian in his 2022 paper writes that, for a DL model, weights and biases are merely parameters to be adjusted automatically during training. And you've got hyperparameters, which are chosen in advance. But beyond that, these things are in general not assigned any specific meaning. Just consider how for a deep network with some hundreds or even thousands of nodes, so no scientist will presumably be able or even bother to sort out what each and every weight and bias would represent. Continues, accordingly, it's not clear what hyperparameters should be taken to represent about the curve, and certainly even less so as to what to represent about the system whose behavior is in turn represented by that curve. Given this apparent meaninglessness of parameters, I submit that in contrast to traditional mathematical models, the interpretation of the DL model stems entirely from the conceptualization of input and output. So it's not exactly saying that, there couldn't be representations inside of a DL model, but there's significant skepticism, I think, from Florian here about what that might come to. Clearly, there are also some assumptions working in the background about what it would take for a DL model, for the internal components of a DL model to represent. So I think for the purposes of trying to see whether, thinking about what you need to do to run an AI-specific no miracles argument, it would be enough if you could show that there could be accurate representation without agents or their intentions. And fortunately, there's a very large body of work that attempts to do just that, namely naturalistic theories of mental content. And there are, of course, lots of options here for how that might go. Maybe having representational content is having the right causal structure. Maybe you need to be instantiate patterns of asymmetrical dependence with respect to internal states and worldly properties or states of affairs. Maybe it's some kind of structural similarity between two objects. Maybe there's a teleosemantic story to be told here in terms of take your pick, evolutionary history, producers and consumers. If you've come anywhere close to this literature, you can kind of you'll be familiar with the typical examples. I guess state-of-the-art accounts like Nick Shea's are sort of a hybrid, so they incorporate different elements. But so the thought here, without trying to sort of come down hard and say, look, this is the right way to think about how a DL system could contain representations. For the purposes of just thinking about what you need to do to get this kind of argument off the ground, we want to say, look, these theories are at least compatible with AI systems having representations, because AlphaFold, for example, just to take the asymmetric dependence example, internal states of AlphaFold could stand in the appropriate relations of asymmetric dependence with certain kinds of, say, protein properties. So these theories are at least compatible. So if you want to run this kind of argument, you should help yourself with one of these. And I mean, this is additionally sort of worth pointing out. This is the kind of thing that a scientific realist should be kind of okay with, at least insofar as realists, well, many defenses of these sort of naturalistic accounts at various points appeal to NMA-like considerations. So this is the kind of move that a scientific realist, I mean, obviously there's, questions of details, but it's the kind of move that a scientific realist should be comfortable with. Obviously here, like I said, there's sort of, lots of questions about how this all shakes out in detail. There's a little bit of literature on this already. Finton Mallory has some really interesting, but I think currently unpublished work, trying to think about how sort of a producer-consumer teleosemantics would shake out in the case of a very simple word embedding program or system like Word2Vec. And I think there's a recent paper, it's coming out in BJPS by Jacqueline Harding investigating some of these issues too. So this is sort of like an ongoing and extremely large issue, but for our purpose, we just want to say look, this is what you ought to do. Okay. So the third reason why you might be skeptical of running an AI-specific no miracles argument, recall, is that the traditional argument is framed in terms of scientific theories. And you might think that there's no appropriate analog of a theory in a system like AlphaFold 2. And that's not unreasonable, I don't think. AlphaFold 2 is trained on a large database of solved protein structures and templates. But it's not given sort of physical principles concerning protein folding as input. So is there an appropriate analog of a theory here? It's not clear. So I think there's a more general sort of issue here, and thinking about the more general problem is sort of useful in this case, though. So, I mean, the very simple picture I gave you early on of this, mature theory where, you give it some initial conditions, and then, you've got this gizmo that outputs predictions. That's not really how science works. And so even in the case of predictions generated ordinarily in the course of science, you need a lot more representational machinery than just sort of a theory narrowly construed. And this is kind of captured by some of Duhame's remarks about crucial experiments. There, the thought is just that when you have an experiment that fails, there's lots of ways that you can account for that. Maybe you've made some approximations that are incorrect. Maybe you made some assumptions about your instrumentation that are wrong. So in cases of failure, there's lots of ways to distribute blame, but similarly in the case of success. So here's a non-AI related case to just sort of illustrate the main point. So once upon a time, we didn't know that Neptune existed, but we did know that Uranus existed. And Leverrier, this fellow here, figured out that Neptune existed. And he did this by looking at perturbations in the orbit of Uranus. So at the time, Uranus exhibits some discrepancies between where in its orbital position, not sort of captured by Newtonian gravitation. And the reason for this, just to sort of tell you what's going on here, is if you have Neptune, so it's perturbing Uranus's orbit. If Neptune is a little bit ahead, like in B, then it pulls Uranus in front of where it ought to be. And if Neptune is behind, then Uranus feels a little bit of sort of drag from Neptune. And it turns out that sort of inferring the existence of Neptune and its properties from discrepancies in Uranus's orbit is extremely difficult. So Hansen has like a really nice paper on this, and here's how he describes the problem. If one knows the planet's mass and its orbital elements, the disturbance it produces in another body is easily determined. This is the classical problem of perturbations. Leverrier's problem consists in describing the disturbances in Uranus, from which he then infers the mass and orbital elements of the disturbing planet. This is the inverse perturbation problem, and it's considerably more intricate to resolve than the classical problem. So Leverrier had to use sort of a wide variety of representational tools. He had to use some phenomenological laws, basically just estimates of like how far planets are spaced from the central body. So that sort of got him in the ballpark of where, if there were a planet, where it would be. He had to use sort of observations of where Uranus was, but also other planets as well. Idealization, so he's treating these as point particles, and various other things too. So the point, I mean, I guess sort of the take-home point here is that even in the pen and paper case, theory of the sort that you're interested in for the no miracles argument is going to cover a lot more than just a theory narrowly construed. It's going to involve things like approximations, assumptions that you've made to animate your theory, models, and much else besides. Okay, so why does all that matter for an AI-specific no miracles argument? If it turns out that NMA is quite generally, so no miracles arguments quite generally have to appeal to diverse representation machinery, you should probably expect the same thing for an AI-specific one, too. So the thought would be, you should be open to the possibility of there being correlates of things like initial conditions, models, and sort of the full variety of predictive machinery that we find elsewhere in science, and perhaps much more too. I mean, that's sort of the tantalizing suggestions about these systems. So yeah, in other words, we should be open to the possibility of different kinds of representational machinery in systems like AlphaFold. Okay, so where does this leave us? Yeah, you want to run an AI-specific no miracles argument, you should do three things. Use the notion of representational accuracy in place of the notion of approximate truth. Lean on naturalistic accounts of representation to account for representation in the absence of agents or their intentions. and be open to the possibility of these things containing models, initial conditions, approximations, and other kinds of representation machinery, which might not correspond to theories narrowly construed. Okay. So here's our traditional no miracles argument. And here's an AI specific one. A lot of these assumptions are sort of operating in the background, but the thought is, again, you're going to still, at least on this probabilistic rendering, have a comparison of likelihoods. So approx A is the claim that, for example, AlphaFold 2 accurately represents its task-related target phenomena. And then S sub A is just that AlphaFold 2 is empirically successful, again, focusing on sort of novel predictions, novel predictive successes. And then the argument goes through just the same way. The likelihood, so premise one is that the likelihood of empirical success, given that it accurately represents task-related targets, is high. The likelihood of success, given that it, the negation of accurately representing is low. And then the conclusion is the likelihood of accurately representing task-related phenomena, target phenomena, is high, given its success. Okay. I do it for time. So maybe let me skip to back to the biochemists. So that paper I mentioned at the beginning tries to figure out, sort of think about what is it about AlphaFold that accounts for its success, and they sort of start by noticing that these things appear to be black boxes that work by magic, very sort of suggestive parallel to something like a no miracles argument or no miracles concern. But they go on and say that really it's only sort of superficially what's happening. Actually, what AlphaFold does is figure out the complex interrelationships of a protein's residues that dictate what structure that protein sequence adopts, much like template selection in traditional structure prediction. And here the thought is this is just what you would expect if an AI specific or I guess a deep learning specific no miracles argument were sound. So where does this leave us? Sort of two ways. So if you're a scientific realist and you endorse the traditional no miracles argument, you should probably also expect the AI specific no miracles argument to modulo the kinds of modifications and relaxations we suggested. So you should think that predictably successful systems like AlphaFold 2 have learned something like, and this is sort of a fudge, but something like a general principle concerning protein folding. That doesn't have to be a completely general principle, but something, you know, it hasn't just learned, it's not just sort of reproducing its training data. So that's one upshot for the scientific realist. If you're sort of a practitioner, this might be useful for you insofar as, you know, if you could develop like XAI tools for extracting the kinds of representations that have been learned, that's going to help you understand something about your target domain. There is some work, I mean, we already saw one case of trying to account for AlphaFold, trying to understand AlphaFold success, but there is other work trying to understand, you know, what it's actually doing. For instance, hasn't learned any physical principles of protein folding. There's some work by a group at Oxford working on this. Their answer is no, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't learned something else, and I can tell you more about that case in Q&A if you're curious. So that's one thing this might do for you if you're sort of a practitioner. A second, though, would be that it'll help you earn the right to representation talk with respect to these kinds of systems. So if you like sort of a traditional no miracles argument, here are two takeaways for you potentially. However, none of what we said sort of assumes that the traditional no miracles argument is sound. And it could actually be that the AI specific or machine learning specific version is a reductio of the standard no miracles argument, modulo the sorts of assumptions that we've recommended. If it turned out that our best explanation for why something like AlphaFold was predictably successful didn't appeal to the fact that it learned approximately true, or I should say representationally accurate, sufficiently representationally accurate principles concerning protein folding, then you should do the modus tollens, perhaps, on the traditional empirical argument. So the thought here is that these arguments sort of stand or fall in parallel. And so sort of the tantalizing suggestion here is that depending on our sort of final understanding of applicable to, this might yield a novel argument against scientific realism. Of course, it remains to be seen whether this is the case. That's all we got. Thank you.